In the town of Umira, life didn't rush. It strolled like an old man with a walking stick, steady, stubborn, and with no concern for the future. It was the kind of place where the air tasted of palm kernel smoke and cassava dust, and where the trees knew everyone by name. The sun rose not just to light the land, but to watch over secrets buried in the clay. Among the quiet homes scattered like pebbles on the Kundu hills was a modest one-story house that smelled of camphor and thyme. It belonged to Elsie Ayuba, a woman whose presence did not shake rooms but stilled them. Elsie was not a woman you'd notice twice on the road. Her frame was small, her dresses were simple, and her hair, always tied in a bun, had surrendered years ago to strands of gray. Yet there was something about her silence that wrapped around people like a wool shawl on a Harmattan morning, warm, enduring, and slightly frayed at the edges. She lived as though she was walking a tightrope between obedience and sacrifice, a life tucked in the shadow of her husband, Jonas. To outsiders, theirs was a respectable marriage. He was the merchant who wore clean shoes and shook hands firmly. She was the dutiful wife whose smile never reached her eyes. But Umira had learned that what glittered was often hiding rust. The women at the well sometimes whispered when she passed by, "That one, too quiet, but quiet water runs deep," and it did. For inside Elsie, beneath the gentle greetings and folded laundry, was a quiet knowing, a kind of wisdom that comes only from years of suffering that cannot be named aloud. Jonas Ayuba was once the kind of man whose name turned heads at village meetings, and whose laughter rang through market stalls like a song everyone knew. He was not rich, not yet, but he was rising like dough in warm air. His business in palm oil and grains had opened doors, but it was his charm that kept them open. Women adored him, elders praised him, and men envied the way he seemed to dance between fortune and favor without stepping on a single crack. When he married Elsie, people said he had found balance, a quiet woman to steady his boldness. At first it seemed true. He brought home pineapples wrapped in paper, kissed her cheeks in public, and always held her hand during the Sunday sermon, like she was his anchor. But time is a mirror, and when you stare long enough, it shows you what you tried to ignore. Slowly the gift stopped, the kisses turned to nods. His eyes wandered to places where her name no longer followed. He started returning home smelling of aftershave that didn't belong to him. Excuses replaced explanations. He became a man of shadows, present in body, absent in heart. At first, Elsie excused it. Work must be hard, she told herself. The load of provision is not light. But with each passing month, his silence became colder, not peaceful but punishing. Sometimes he would walk past her like she was furniture. He never raised a hand to her. He didn't need to. His absence hit harder than any slap ever could. And when he did speak, his words came sharp and short, like the snap of a twig, brief, breaking, final. The man who once quoted scripture during dinner now used silence as his gospel. But Elsie did not fight. She simply adjusted. She folded her hopes neatly into the back of her wardrobe and wore resignation like an apron. Elsie had grown to understand that in a marriage like hers, emotions had to be managed like firewood, used sparingly, never wasted on the wrong flame. When her heart swelled with questions, she stuffed them into pots of soup and buckets of water. Her sorrow became a rhythm, scrub, sweep, stir, repeat. Every room in the house was her confessional, and each corner carried a secret prayer. The only time she allowed herself to cry was in the bathroom, with the shower running, so no one, especially not Jonas, would hear her breaking. But even those moments grew rare. She learned to carry her ache like a secret pouch tucked under her blouse, never shown, never spoken of, always there. Friends tried to draw her out. "Let's go to the festival," one said. "Come sit with us under the almond tree," another offered. But she always declined with a gentle smile and an excuse well rehearsed. In truth, her spirit had grown thin. It fluttered inside her like a candle in wind. But still she moved, because movement meant life, and life meant she hadn't been swallowed yet. Late at night, she would read her Bible under the weak glow of a rechargeable lamp. Her fingers lingered on verses that felt like home. "We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair." The words gave her just enough to make it to the next day. She started writing letters to herself, prayers she dared not speak aloud, folded and tucked beneath the mattress. God, she wrote in one, help me to remember who I was before love taught me to disappear. No one knew, not even Jonas, how deeply she hurt, and no one knew, not even Elsie, how deeply she would rise. The morning it all unraveled began like any other, with the sound of kettles, bird chirps, and the low hum of a generator down the road. Elsie had woken early, as always, tying her wrapper tightly as though it could hold her soul together. She boiled water for Pap, arranged Jonas's toiletries, and laid out his clothes without being asked. It had become a ritual of survival to serve, so that she wouldn't have to feel. Jonas entered the kitchen with a face like thunderclouds, his brows knotted, his jaw tight. He didn't sit, he didn't greet. He simply said, I want a divorce. No preamble, no softening. The words landed between them like a dropped knife, sharp and final. Elsie froze, wooden spoon midair, then slowly turned to face him. Her mouth didn't move, her eyes didn't widen, but something behind them shifted, like a door closing forever. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable, like a sky holding back rain. Jonas expected drama, because that's what guilt needs to feel justified. But Elsie gave him none. She simply nodded, wiped her hands on a cloth, and resumed stirring. The water boiled over, hissing as if it too had something to say. He mumbled something else, but she wasn't listening. Her ears had folded into themselves, retreating from the world. Later that day she washed the dishes twice, swept the same corner 3 times, and sang an old hymn that no one else remembered. That night she sat on the veranda, watching the stars like old friends she hadn't seen in a while. In her lap the Bible lay open to Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. She whispered it again and again, until it began to breathe itself. No one saw the battle she had begun to fight, not with fists, but with stillness. For some wars, the only weapon needed is patience. The morning of the divorce hearing arrived not with fanfare, but with a sky so heavy it looked like it had been holding its breath all night. A thin mist lay low across the red dirt roads of Umura, the kind that made everything feel uncertain and half-dreamed. Jonas stood in front of the mirror in his room, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. He whistled, not a tune of joy, but a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the hallway like a bird trapped in the wrong season. In the living room, Fiona was already dressed, head high, back straight, and wearing a perfume so thick it could have been poured rather than sprayed. She wore a fitted emerald dress that clung to her like wet leaves in the rain. The heels on her shoes clicked against the cement floor like punctuation marks, announcing her arrival before she even stepped outside. She looked at Jonas with a gleam of amusement, tugging slightly at his collar, whispering something crude in his ear. He chuckled, more out of pride than humor. Today, he said, running a hand across her lower back, marks the beginning of a new chapter. Fiona gave a wicked grin and kissed his cheek, leaving a crimson imprint like a signature at the end of a contract. As they walked toward the gate, Fiona paused and turned, glancing at the house behind her. You sure she'll show up? She asked. Jonas gave a short nod. She's too proud not to. Fiona scoffed. Pride, she said. That woman has the spine of a worm. Jonas didn't correct her. He didn't say that somewhere, beneath all that quietness, Elsie had the kind of strength that didn't need to speak to be felt. He was too blind with arrogance to recognize the quiet tremor before an earthquake. The court was a square building with peeling paint and a single dusty ceiling fan that squeaked every few seconds like a bird caught in wire. It was not designed to carry the weight of betrayal, but on that day it did just that. The room filled slowly with murmurs and sideways glances, everyone curious to see what kind of woman would allow her husband to bring his mistress to the divorce table. Fiona walked in first, hips swaying like a pendulum, her confidence worn as loudly as her clothes. The clerk behind the desk raised a brow but said nothing. Jonas followed, his shoes clicking with the pride of a man who thought shame was for the weak. When Elsie entered, the room seemed to shift, just slightly. She wasn't dressed in mourning black or screaming red. She wore a simple white blouse tucked into a faded blue wrapper, and on her head was a scarf neatly tied with the humility of a woman who came not to fight, but to finish. Her footsteps made no sound, but her presence spoke louder than drums. Fiona sneered. She leaned into Jonas and whispered, "Is this it?" This is who had you tied down." Jonas didn't respond. For a second, just a second, his face faltered. He saw the lines on Elsie's face, the kind drawn not by age but by sacrifice. He saw how still she was, how composed, like water that refuses to ripple even under storm. He suddenly realized he had forgotten something important. The quiet ones remember everything. The judge arrived, old and tired, with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. As he took his seat, he glanced at the file before him, and then at the three people seated in front. "So," he said dryly, "a man, his wife, and his companion. Sounds like the beginning of a foolish proverb." A few chuckles echoed, and Fiona rolled her eyes. The hearing began. When the judge asked Elsie if she had anything to say in response to the divorce filing, she sat still for a long moment. It wasn't hesitation, it was precision. She inhaled as though she was taking in the weight of 12 years in one breath. Then she spoke, low, even, and calm, like a hymn hummed under your breath when no one is listening. "Let him have what he seeks," she said. "I will not wrestle over what no longer belongs to me." Her voice had no tremble, no bite, just truth. Jonas felt a strange discomfort crawl up his spine, but he shoved it down. Fiona, however, wasn't done performing. "Well," she said loudly, turning to the room, "some of us know when to move on. Others prefer to rot in silence." Her laugh bounced off the walls like broken glass. Elsie didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't even blink. Instead, she turned to the judge and added, "Let the documents reflect peace. That is all I ask." The judge scribbled something on his pad, then paused, studying her. There was something about the way she sat there, unwavering, that made him momentarily forget he was a man used to seeing women wail and beg in that very seat. "You sure you don't want to claim anything?" he asked almost softly. "He's admitted to adultery. You're entitled to half of everything." Elsie's hands folded in her lap. "Peace," she said again. "And distance," Fiona snorted. Jonas chuckled too, though it sounded forced. But no one in that room, not even Elsie, knew that her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. A lioness doesn't growl before the kill. She watches, she waits, and then when the prey relaxes, she strikes. By the time the session ended, it was barely noon, but the day felt heavy with things left unsaid. Outside the courtroom, the sun blazed with unrepentant heat, cooking the sidewalk till it smelled like scorched earth. Fiona leaned against a pillar, fanning herself with the back of her hand, while Jonas spoke to the clerk about where to sign. Elsie didn't linger. She walked out without a backward glance, her wrapper dragging slightly on the dusty floor, her steps unhurried. She passed by a young girl carrying a basin of plantain on her head, and when their eyes met, the girl smiled in admiration. It was not for beauty or fashion, but for the way Elsie carried herself, like someone who had wrestled pain into submission. Jonas watched her go. Something gnawed at him, something like guilt but harder, sharper. He brushed it off like a mosquito. "Well," Fiona said, nudging him playfully, "that was easier than I thought. Now we can finally live like we want to." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The wind shifted, blowing a swirl of dust around their feet. "You did good," Fiona added, cutting dead weight. But deep in Jonah's gut, a question rose he couldn't answer. What if the weight wasn't dead, but rooted? What if he had just cut off the very thing that kept him grounded? He shook his head. No, he told himself, this was right. He had moved on. He had made his choice. But as they walked away from the courthouse, he didn't realize that some victories are dressed like freedom. But they come with chains, the kind you don't feel until you're alone. The day after the hearing, a strange kind of silence settled over the house like a fresh coat of dust. Jonas expected that Elsie would come home, if only to pack her belongings and leave behind the air that once held their shared breath. But evening came, and no footsteps creaked on the back porch. The water pot remained untouched. Her towel still hung by the door, but she was nowhere in sight. At first, he dismissed it with a shrug, telling himself she was sulking at a cousin's house or seeking comfort among the women who still wore pity like jewelry. But by the third day, her absence had grown teeth. There were no notes, no messages passed through neighbors, no calls. Even her childhood friend, Falmata, hadn't seen her. Jonas had half a mind to check the local clinic, but pride held him back. He told Fiona not to worry, but even Fiona, loud as she usually was, had gone quiet with suspicion. She flipped through her phone at dinner that evening, saying nothing, while Jonas chewed rice that tasted like sand. That night, he tossed in bed, the heat of Fiona's body beside him doing little to calm the chill in his chest. The ceiling fan made slow circles above him, and with every spin, a single thought pushed through the haze in his mind. Where did she go? Guilt never came through the front door. It crept in like smoke under a cracked window. Even the walls seemed to remember her, how she used to hum to herself while mopping the floor, how her slippers made that soft shish sound along the corridor. The house was cleaner now, but it felt less alive. Fiona had rearranged the living room, tossed out Elsie's pots, brought in curtains so bright they looked like they were arguing with the sun, but still nothing settled. Everything looked new, but nothing felt right. The whispers in town started small, like wind stirring dry leaves. One woman at the tailor's shed mentioned how she hadn't seen Elsie at the Thursday market. Another added she'd walked by the Ayuba's house and noticed the windows were closed longer than usual. The women didn't say much at first, but eyes speak louder than tongues, and soon the village vine thickened with questions no one dared ask aloud. A week passed, then two. The pastor even asked after her during the Sunday benediction. "We lift up our sister Elsie wherever she may be," he said, his voice laced with curiosity disguised as concern. Jonas was present that day, sitting beside Fiona in the third row. He shifted in his seat, coughed into his fist, and avoided eye contact. Fiona gripped his hand tighter than necessary. After the service, a few old women approached them, offering plastic smiles and thinly veiled inquiries. "Ah, Brother Jonas," one said, her head slightly tilted. "We trust all is well in the household." He nodded, lips pressed tight, and excused himself. Fiona followed, but not before glancing back at the women with a smirk that did little to hide the crack in her confidence. At home, things began to feel off in ways Jonas couldn't explain. The faucet in the guest bathroom dripped constantly, despite being recently fixed. The light in the hallway flickered whenever Fiona walked under it. The floorboards creaked in the middle of the night, though no one was moving. Once he swore he heard the front gate creak open just before dawn, but when he stepped outside, nothing stirred. Even the birds seemed to avoid their compound. Fiona, for all her boldness, began to wake with red eyes and shaking hands. She said little, spent more time on the phone, and once muttered in her sleep. She was standing there, by the window, watching. Jonas didn't ask who, he already knew. The letter came on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper, placed neatly on the doorstep. There was no knock, no voice calling out, just the faint smell of rain in the air and the sound of distant thunder. Jonas picked it up, turning it over in his hands as though expecting it to vanish. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, slanted, and deliberate. He opened it slowly, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt borrowed. Inside was a single black-and-white photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It showed him asleep in his bed, mouth slightly open, one arm draped across Fiona's back. The photo had been taken from inside the room. His blood ran cold. On the back, written in red ink, were 7 words. "You will learn what silence can do." Jonas sat down on the doorstep, the envelope still in his hands, feeling the weight of the air around him shift. He looked up, but the street was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, not even the usual mutter of distant gossip. For the first time in years, he felt watched. Not by people, but by something older, something that did not blink or breathe, but remembered. That night he couldn't sleep. Fiona noticed, of course. She asked once, twice, then gave up when he didn't answer. He lay staring at the ceiling, blinking in sync with the flashing light bulb above him. He couldn't shake the image, the curve of his back, the threadbare sheet, the unmistakable angle from which the picture had been taken. He checked the room twice, then a third time. Nothing seemed disturbed, and yet everything felt violated. He didn't know what scared him more, the photo itself, or the idea that someone had been close enough to take it. Fiona found the letter in the trash the next morning. She read it, didn't say a word, and left the house without breakfast. She didn't return until after dark. Wherever Elsie was, she had become wind, present, invisible, and impossible to predict. But far from Umura, tucked behind the thick brush of the Kundu Hills, there was a path few dared to walk alone. It wasn't marked by signs, only stories, old ones. stories about a woman called Maba, whose hut stood near a stream that never dried, even during drought. Some said she was a healer. Others called her a keeper of reckoning, but no one denied that those who climbed that path left something behind. It was to her that Elsie had gone, not with bitterness, but with a heart full of questions. She arrived with a small bag, wearing shoes covered in dust and a look in her eyes that spoke of endings. Maba did not ask her name. She didn't have to. She simply opened the door and gestured for her to sit. Inside, the room smelled of burnt herbs, ashes, and earth. The walls were lined with feathers, beads, and symbols no one had taught Elsie to read, yet she somehow understood them. Maba watched her for a long time without speaking. When she finally did, her voice was like gravel soaked in rain. "Tell me where it hurts." And Elsie did, not in the way people talk in public, but in the way a wound breathes when the bandage is removed. She spoke of silence, betrayal, small deaths that came from being overlooked. Maba listened, nodding slowly, fingers tracing invisible patterns on her lap. "You do not want revenge," she said finally. "No," Elsie whispered. "I want release." Maba stood, walked to the hearth, and scooped a handful of ash into a calabash bowl. "Then let silence speak for you. Not the kind that hides, but the kind that haunts." Elsie nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting the weight of the words. She had walked away from noise, only to find power in stillness. The heat in Umara that season was strange, thick, suffocating, and unrelenting. It wasn't just the sun that scorched the ground. It was something deeper, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jonas began to walk slower, speak less, and listen more, though not because he had grown wiser, but because his confidence had started to shrink like cotton in hot water. The charm he once carried like a second skin no longer fit him. Clients began to delay their payments. Orders were canceled without explanation. A warehouse inspection uncovered missing inventory he had no explanation for. One by one, the supports under his business started to collapse, not with the sound of falling bricks, but with the quiet disintegration of things rotting from within. He blamed bad luck at first, then the economy, then his staff. But in quiet moments, when Fiona had gone out and the house was still, he allowed himself a flicker of doubt. Could it be connected? Could her absence be more than mere departure? He dismissed the thought like one swats away a fly, but it kept returning. Even Fiona had started to notice things were off. Her laughter, once effortless, had grown forced. She paced the house more, stopped wearing her heels, and often sat outside at dusk, staring blankly at nothing. Once he found her burning incense and whispering a prayer she never learned in church. He asked her what she was doing, and she replied without looking at him, "Trying to clean the air. It's too heavy in here." Jonas laughed, but it sounded hollow. The house, once buzzing with ego and indulgence, now felt like a theater after the final act, silent, shadowed, and full of abandoned costumes. On the morning Fiona screamed, the rooster hadn't even crowed. Jonas jumped out of bed like a soldier hearing gunfire. She was standing near the mirror in the hallway, her hands trembling, and her lips murmuring something that didn't quite make sense. The mirror, cracked at the corner, showed nothing unusual, but she kept pointing, her face white with fear. She was there. I swear by everything holy she was standing there, looking at me. Jonas stared at her, unsure whether to hold her or shake her. He reached for her shoulder, but she recoiled like a dog remembering a beating. He tried to calm her down, offering explanations that even he didn't believe. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe she had been dreaming with her eyes open. Maybe it was the mirror playing games, but her fear wasn't imagined. It sat in her chest like a stone. That afternoon she packed a small bag without saying a word, placed it by the door, and sat beside it in silence. Jonas paced the house like a trapped animal, unsure what to do. Every door creaked louder than it should. Every window seemed to shift slightly when he passed. That evening, he found another letter slipped under the front door. This one bore no photograph, just a folded paper with a single sentence written in dark ink. "The silence you mocked will now speak in echoes." He sat down on the sofa and stared at the message as if it would explain itself. Fiona watched him from across the room, her fingers digging into her knees. She didn't ask who sent it. She didn't need to. That night she moved her bag to the bedroom door. The next morning, she was gone. Jonas now wandered through his own home as though he were visiting a stranger's house. The sounds had changed, the floorboards groaned differently, the pipes wheezed. The wind howled in through gaps he never noticed before. The electricity flickered often, and his sleep came in short, restless spells. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her humming, distant but unmistakable. Not Fiona. That low, steady tune she used to hum while slicing vegetables or folding clothes. It drifted to him like a ghost of memory, uninvited and persistent. He started leaving the lights on at night, then the radio too, hoping noise would drive it away. But it didn't. He found himself walking into rooms with no reason, standing still, forgetting why he came in. Sometimes he saw her in his dreams, dressed in white, standing in the middle of their old living room, her face unreadable. She never spoke. She just looked at him with eyes that knew things he could not hide. The dreams were never violent, yet they left him waking in sweat. One morning, he looked at himself in the mirror and hardly recognized what stared back. His eyes looked sunken, his skin lost its color. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The house was quiet, yet it felt loud. That's when he started locking the windows, as though he could keep whatever haunted him outside. But the truth was, it wasn't the house that was haunted. It was him. The guilt, the shame, the betrayal, they had finally found their voice. And in the absence of anyone else, his own conscience had become his tormentor. Far from the chaos unraveling behind him, Elsie had embraced a silence not of retreat, but of power. Old Maba's hut sat nestled under the shade of iroko trees, where the air smelled of wet leaves and sacred things. The days passed with slow purpose. Elsie spent them gathering herbs, sweeping the compound with short, deliberate strokes, and watching the fire crackle as pots boiled without urgency. She didn't speak much, and Maba never asked her to. Silence was the language of that space. Words, after all, had failed her once. How many times had she spoken her heart only for it to be ignored, dismissed, or weaponized? Here she was learning to speak again, not with her mouth, but with her presence. Maba taught her how to mix roots and oils, how to read a person's spirit by how their shadow behaved in sunlight. One night, they sat beneath the stars, and Maba placed a small clay bowl between them filled with fine gray ash. Ashes, she said, are what remains after fire has had its say, and yet it is in ashes that things are reborn. Elsie looked into the bowl and saw not soot, but memory. Her old life, her sacrifices, her hurt. She had burned, yes, but she had not vanished. She was still here, stronger, more focused. The next morning, Maba handed her a small satchel. Inside were carefully wrapped herbs and a piece of parchment. "You will know when to use this," the old woman said, her voice neither soft nor stern, but certain. Elsie bowed slightly, not in submission, but in gratitude. That day, she began her journey down the hill, the same road she had climbed with a heavy heart. But now her steps were firmer, her eyes steadier. She wasn't returning to make noise. She was returning to let the silence speak for itself, and this time it would be heard. The day of the final court hearing arrived with an unusual stillness in the air, the kind that hinted not at peace, but at the gathering of something unspoken. Even the wind in Umera, usually reckless at that time of year, moved like it had something to hide. Jonas rose early, but not because he had anywhere to rush to. Sleep had long abandoned him. His eyes were sunken, dark like burnt clay, and his shirt hung looser around his neck than it once did. There was no Fiona to fix his collar or ask if he was ready. There was no warm cup of tea on the table, no background noise of humming or pots clanking in the kitchen. Only the low groan of the refrigerator and the dull ache behind his eyes kept him company. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time, as if expecting a version of himself to appear and fix what had crumbled, but there was no man left to fix, only the remnants of one. He ironed his own shirt that morning, burned the edge, but wore it anyway. When he locked the front door, the click of the bolt sounded final, like the closing of a chapter. The courthouse loomed in the distance like a waiting mouth, ready to swallow whatever dignity he still had left. He didn't drive. He walked. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the faces he passed on the road didn't greet him with the usual nods or smiles. They just watched, the way people watch a fire from afar, not close enough to feel the heat, but near enough to sense the danger. A boy selling oranges at the junction stared at him, then whispered to his companion. Jonas heard the words, though they were said softly. That's the man who brought disgrace home and still lost everything. When he entered the courtroom, the air felt colder than he remembered. The chairs looked smaller, the walls more pale. Everything in the room had shifted in some way, but he couldn't tell if it was the place that had changed or simply his own eyes. His lawyer stood near the front, already flipping through papers with the detached expression of someone who had stopped caring about the outcome. Jonas nodded at him, but the man didn't return the gesture. The judge had not yet arrived, but the clerk motioned for Jonas to sit. He did on the second row alone. The seat felt hard. He looked around, half hoping, half dreading, to see Elsie, and then she entered, quietly, deliberately. No fanfare, no drama. Just a woman walking with the confidence of someone who had made peace with her past. She was dressed in a clean blue gown, her scarf neatly tied. She carried no bag, no files, only a single document in her hand. Her face was neither angry nor triumphant. It held something far more unsettling, stillness. Not the stillness of someone without emotions, but the stillness of someone who had mastered them. Jonas's throat tightened. He looked away, unsure why his palms suddenly felt damp. Elsie took her seat without acknowledging him, though she knew exactly where he was. Her lawyer, a tall woman with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, whispered something into her ear, and she nodded without speaking. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered, eyes weary, robes dragging slightly behind him. "Let's proceed," he said, voice low and gravelly. Jonas couldn't hear every word being exchanged at first. The blood in his ears pounded like a drum. But then Elsie stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't clear her throat or perform for the room. She simply handed her lawyer the document she had brought with her. Her lawyer rose and began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her tone even, "this morning, we submit this as evidence of financial misconduct by Mr. Jonas Ayuba against the legal and spiritual integrity of this marriage." Jonas's head snapped toward her, confusion masking his face like a crooked smile. The lawyer continued, producing papers, stamped and signed, detailing accounts Jonas thought were well hidden. Elsie had retrieved them all, copies of secret withdrawals, bank transfers made under her name, loan agreements he forged when he assumed she would never look into the books. The courtroom stilled as the judge flipped through the pages. Every now and then his brow rose higher, his lips pressing tighter. Jonas tried to interrupt once, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm and whispered something frantic. Elsie did not look at him once. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge as if she had been waiting for this moment not for weeks, but for years. The judge looked up finally, eyes steady on Jonas. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that these actions are not just unethical, they are criminal." Jonas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His tongue felt like sand. He wanted to explain, to blame, to deflect, but none of it came. The words had dried up in the back of his throat like old lies. Elsie's lawyer requested full ownership of all jointly acquired properties in favor of her client. The judge nodded slowly. "Given the deception displayed, I see no reason not to grant the request." The gavel came down, once firm, final. The room seemed to echo with the sound long after it had stopped. Outside, the sun was blinding, as if the heavens themselves were squinting at what had just unfolded. Jonas stood by the courtroom steps, hands shaking, mouth still dry. He watched Elsie walk past him with the quiet grace of a leaf floating down a river, untouched by the chaos around it. She didn't say anything, didn't even glance in his direction, and somehow that absence of recognition stung more than any insult could have. Her silence was not empty. It was full of everything he had ignored, dismissed, and taken for granted. As she reached the gate, a soft wind stirred her scarf, lifting it gently, like the hand of something divine had reached down just to honor her dignity. Jonas turned to his lawyer, but the man was already walking away, briefcase shut, head shaking. He was alone now, truly, no wife, no mistress, no business. Just a man with his consequences, standing in a shadow he had cast all by himself. Across the street, a woman selling bread watched him with narrowed eyes, her hands kneading dough while her eyes judged his soul. He looked away. Everything felt loud, the traffic, the voices, the crows calling from the trees. He rubbed his face with both hands and tried to catch his breath, but the air around him felt too tight to inhale. A young boy passed by with a Bible tucked under his arm, reciting memory verses for a church competition. Jonas heard the boy shout clearly, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." He froze, his ears rang. The words stayed with him like ink spilled across his thoughts. He had sowed pride, betrayal, and silence, and now the harvest has come. Jonas Ayuba's fall didn't come all at once like a tree struck by lightning. No, it came in fragments, like a clay pot dropped from waist height, first a crack, then a hairline split, and eventually a shattering so quiet it could almost be missed. After the court judgment, he became a man untethered. His house, once alive with footsteps, perfumes, and pride, stood like an empty shell, stripped of meaning. The gates rusted faster, as if even the metal had lost the will to stand tall. The tiles lost their shine, the walls grew faint stains, and cobwebs clung to corners like judgmental memories. Without Fiona's noise and Elsie's quiet order, the house echoed strangely, like a hollow drum beaten by the wind. He tried to clean one morning, swept the sitting room, wiped the glass center table, even opened windows to let air in, but nothing smelled fresh. It was as though the house itself refused his penance. His attempts to restart his business were short-lived. Clients no longer picked up calls, vendors no longer extended credit, and whispers had grown like vines around his name. Even his once loyal driver had stopped returning to work, without offering any reason. When he walked to the town square, people shifted their eyes away. The greetings, if they came at all, were shallow, forced, stiff. He was no longer Oga Jonas. Now he was the man who gambled and lost everything. His days blurred into one another. He began to sleep long into the afternoons and stare at the ceiling for hours at night. Sometimes he muttered to himself, half convinced that speaking aloud might make the silence less cruel. But silence doesn't pity, it remembers. It remembers everything you once ignored. The road to redemption is long, especially when one doesn't know where it begins. For Jonas, that journey didn't start with an apology, nor with any noble realization. It began with a hunger he couldn't satisfy. Not physical hunger, though that too became familiar, but a hunger of the soul, a gnawing emptiness that no meal, no drink, no sleep could silence. He wandered the outskirts of Umara aimlessly, often walking past buildings he once helped fund, churches where he was once welcomed with reserved seats, and homes where he had once been greeted with laughter. He passed a group of young men repairing a broken bench beneath a mango tree, and when they noticed him, they stopped talking altogether. One of them snorted softly, not in humor, but in disdain. That moment lingered in his chest long after he turned the corner. Shame had built a permanent room in him. Even the children, once fond of his imported sweets and playful whistles, now watched him warily. One girl hid behind her mother's wrapper when he approached the well. He noticed everything now. He had all the time in the world to notice. In the evenings, he began sitting on a low stool by the roadside, the same stool he once considered too common for someone of his status. The irony didn't escape him. He watched life move on without him. Markets opened, trucks passed, bells rang from the chapel tower, and still he sat there unmoving. Sometimes he thought of writing to Elsie. A letter, something. But what do you say to a woman you wounded so thoroughly that even her silence left a scar? No apology felt wide enough to cover what he had done, so he kept quiet, letting his days unfold like torn pages in a forgotten book, unsure how many chapters remained. Elsie Ayuba, meanwhile, did not return to Umara with banners or boldness. She came back as gently as she had lived, carrying no bitterness in her bag, only peace. The house she now owned, once the site of her humiliation, had changed under her touch. She painted the walls a soft cream, replaced the heavy curtains with light linen, and planted sunflowers by the fence. The rooms, once filled with echoes of neglect, now held the laughter of children. She had converted the sitting room into a small reading space where young girls came to study after school. She served them biscuits and zobo, helped them sound out difficult words, and told them that silence, when shaped with wisdom, could become strength. They didn't know her whole story. She never spoke of it. She didn't need to. Her kindness was enough of a sermon. Sometimes women from the community came too, some heartbroken, some seeking advice, and some just curious. They watched her closely, expecting perhaps a trace of bitterness, a crack in her resolve. But Elsie was not hiding pain anymore. She had given it a name, a place, and left it behind. In the quiet of her evenings she still prayed, not for revenge, but for clarity. She read her Bible beneath the mango tree, the pages marked not with tears anymore, but with notes of gratitude. She often paused at one verse in particular. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. That promise had found a home in her. She did not smile for show now. She smiled because it felt natural. Because peace, once distant, now sat beside her every day like an old friend who finally returned. One afternoon, while picking up supplies from the market, Elsie saw Jonas. He looked older. Not just in the way time makes a man older, but in the way regret carves itself into the lines of a face. He stood near a wooden bench, shoulders slightly slumped, staring at nothing. She paused, not out of hatred, not even out of pity, just pause. He looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Not long, not loud, just enough. He made a motion, a slight step forward, lips parting as if to speak, but Elsie offered only a soft nod and turned away, not abruptly, not in anger, but like someone who understood that some doors, once closed, do not need to be reopened to prove they are strong. As she walked away, she did not carry his gaze with her. She left it behind, like dust shaken off after a long journey. Jonas stood there a while longer, the noise of the market blurring around him, the moment replaying again and again in his mind. He didn't call out, he didn't follow. He understood. At long last he understood. Some women do not shout when they are wronged. They wait, they gather, they rise, and when they finally move, they do so not to destroy, but to become untouchable. He walked back home that evening, not faster or slower than usual, but with the weight of an ending on his back. Inside his small rented room, he lit a candle, opened the Bible for the first time in years, and let his eyes fall on the same verse Elsie once clung to. Be still and know that I am God. It was not too late to learn what silence had been trying to teach him all along. Dear listener, if this story has spoken to your heart, then let it remind you of one deep truth. You don't have to shout to be powerful. There is strength in stillness, grace in silence, and victory in patience. Not every fight is won with fists or fire. Some battles are conquered in secret places, through endurance, through prayer, and through the wisdom to walk away when you are not valued. Sometimes life will test you through betrayal, disrespect, or injustice. But never let another person's blindness become your bitterness. Protect your peace. Let your silence be purposeful, not passive, because what God is building in you quietly will one day speak so loudly, even your enemies will hear it. Just like Elsie, you may feel overlooked, rejected, or forgotten, but take heart, God never forgets those who endure with faith. The pain you feel is not permanent, and the story does not end in your suffering. It ends in your rising. And when God lifts you, He does it in such a way that even those who mocked you will have no choice but to watch in silence. So don't let heartbreak define you. Don't let betrayal bury you. Instead, let it become the soil where your strength takes root. Hold your head high, even if your heart is healing, because the same God who sees in secret will reward you openly. Just be still and let Him be God. Now I want to pray with you. Wherever you are, whatever season you're walking through, may these words settle in your heart like peace after a storm. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, for every listener who has been broken by betrayal, who has cried in silence, who has served and loved, but was still pushed aside, Lord, I ask that you become their strength. Let every heart that's been crushed by disrespect receive healing that flows deeper than words. Let those who have been mocked or humiliated receive honor in the place of their shame. Father, lift every weary soul who is waiting for justice. Remind them that they are not forgotten. Wrap them in your mercy, dress them in dignity, and restore everything they lost in silence. May their silence become their strength. May their pain become their power. And may their scars become sacred stories of survival. Let your light break forth like dawn in every listener's life. Let your favor surround them like a shield. May they rise above the ashes of rejection and walk boldly into the restoration you have prepared. Where doors were slammed shut, Open new ones that no one can close. Where voices tried to drown them, let your voice speak louder, words of life, words of love. Bless every listener with clarity, wisdom, and peace. May no bitterness grow in their hearts, only beauty. And for every tear they've shed in private, let testimonies shout in public. In Jesus' mighty name, the name that heals, restores, and elevates. Amen. If you believe that this prayer is for you, if you're trusting God for healing, for peace, for restoration, type Amen in the comments. Declare it with faith. Claim it for your life. And share this story with someone who needs to hear. You may have been broken in silence, but you will rise in power. God bless you. More stories, more truth, more grace coming soon.